Dominic Castellano owned half of Chicago's South Side, but he couldn't own the quiet defiance in Ruby Morgan's eyes when she threw his $50 bill back at his chest. The restaurant fell silent. His men reached for their guns, but Dominic raised one hand, stopping them, because in that moment, he saw something he hadn't seen in 20 years, someone who wasn't afraid of him. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. The rain came down hard on Chicago that October evening, turning the streets of the South Side into rivers of neon reflections. Dominic Castellano sat in the back booth of Santino's, a restaurant he'd owned since his father died, watching the city through rain-streaked windows. The leather beneath him was worn smooth by decades of deals, threats, and blood money changing hands. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with graying temples that gave him a distinguished look. Women found attractive, and men found intimidating. His suit was custom-tailored, charcoal gray, $3,000 of Italian wool that hung perfectly on his frame. A gold watch caught the candlelight, his father's watch, the only sentimental thing he owned. Around him, his world hummed with controlled power. Marco and Vincent stood near the door, scanning every face that entered. Tommy sat 2 tables over, pretending to eat pasta while keeping one hand near the pistol under his jacket. This was Dominic's kingdom, built on gambling, protection, and the kind of influence that didn't appear in newspapers, but shaped everything that happened in 6 square miles of Chicago. He'd learned the business from his father, Carlo Castellano, who'd taught him that respect was everything, and fear was the currency that bought it. At 16, Dominic had watched his father negotiate with a union boss, never raising his voice, never making a threat, yet somehow the man left pale and shaking. At 20, he'd stood beside his father during the Henderson Street incident, where 3 men who'd stolen from them were found in an alley with broken hands. At 25, he'd held his father as he died from a heart attack, and Carlo's last words were, "Don't let them see you weak." Dominic hadn't. For 17 years, he'd run the organization with an iron fist wrapped in expensive leather. He'd expanded into construction, real estate, and legitimate businesses that washed money cleaner than Lake Michigan after a storm. He had politicians in his pocket, cops on his payroll, and enough lawyers to bury anyone who challenged him in paperwork for decades. But lately, something had shifted inside him. Maybe it was turning 40. Maybe it was the way his daughter, Sophia, looked at him with a mixture of love and fear during their supervised visits. His ex-wife made sure of that. Maybe it was the silence in his penthouse at night, where money bought everything except the sound of genuine laughter. Tonight, he'd come to Santino's for the veal marsala and to meet with Councilman Burke about a zoning variance. Burke was late, probably working up the courage to ask for more money. Dominic didn't mind. He enjoyed these quiet moments before business, watching the city through the glass, feeling the weight of everything he controlled. The restaurant buzzed with its usual Friday crowd, families celebrating birthdays, couples on dates, businessmen entertaining clients. They all knew who owned the place, and they all pretended not to notice the men in suits who never seemed to eat much. It was an unspoken rule in this neighborhood. You respected Dominic Castellano, you didn't ask questions, and you lived a comfortable life. Break the rule, and you found out why 17 years hadn't produced a single rival strong enough to challenge him. A waitress approached his table. New, he noticed immediately. Young, maybe 23 or 24, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and green eyes that held a kind of careful alertness. Her uniform was the standard black dress and white apron, but it was worn at the edges. Washed so many times the black had faded to charcoal in places. Her shoes were scuffed. Her hands, as she set down his water glass, showed the rough redness of someone who worked multiple jobs. "Good evening, Mr. Castellano," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "Can I start you with something from the bar?" He studied her for a moment. Pretty, in an understated way. No makeup except a touch of lipstick. No jewelry except a thin silver chain with a small cross. There was something different about her. Most people who approached his table either fawned over him or trembled. She did neither. She simply waited, professional and distant. "McAllen, neat," he said. "And tell Burke when he arrives that he's paying for his own meal tonight." A flicker of something crossed her face. Amusement, maybe. "Yes, sir." She turned to leave, but Dominic found himself asking, "What's your name?" She paused, looking back. "Ruby, sir. Ruby Morgan." "You're new here, Ruby. Started Monday." Still learning where everything is. She offered a small, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'll get your drink. Dominic watched her walk away, noting the straight posture, the efficient movements. She stopped at another table, greeting an elderly couple with genuine warmth, and he caught himself wondering what her story was. Everyone in his world had a story, usually one involving debt, desperation, or the kind of bad luck that pushed people into the orbit of men like him. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows. Lightning flashed over the skyline, illuminating the Willis Tower in the distance. This was his city, his empire, built on the foundation his father had laid and expanded into something Carlo never could have imagined. He had everything a man could want: power, money, respect. So why did it feel like he was sitting alone in a restaurant full of people? Ruby returned with his scotch, setting it down carefully. Mr. Burke just called. He'll be another 20 minutes. Dominic nodded, lifting the glass. The whiskey was perfect, smoky and smooth. You go to school, Ruby? She hesitated, clearly surprised by the personal question. I did. Dropped out of nursing school at UIC last year. Planning to go back when I save enough. Why'd you drop out? Another hesitation. He could see her weighing whether to answer honestly or give him a polite deflection. Finally, she said, My mom got sick. Medical bills. Someone had to work. There it was. The story. He'd heard variations of it 1,000 times. Good people ground down by circumstances, forced to choose between their dreams and survival. Usually, he didn't care. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, something about her quiet dignity made him pay attention. That's admirable, he said, meaning it. She looked at him directly then, and he saw something flash in those green eyes. Skepticism, maybe even a hint of challenge. Thank you, Mr. Castellano. I'll check on your table in a few minutes. As she walked away, Vincent caught his eye from across the room, raising an eyebrow. Dominic ignored him. He wasn't interested in Ruby Morgan that way. He had women, beautiful women who understood the arrangement and expected nothing beyond expensive gifts and discretion. No, his interest in Ruby was different, though he couldn't quite name it yet. Burke arrived 35 minutes late, sweating despite the October chill, reeking of desperation and cheap cologne. Dominic made him wait another 10 minutes before acknowledging him, a small reminder of who held the power. The conversation was brief and one-sided. Burke needed approval for a waterfront development. Dominic owned the alderman who controlled the vote. The price was $200,000 and 5% of the eventual profits. Burke agreed without negotiation. They always did. Throughout the meal, Dominic found his attention drifting to Ruby as she worked her section. She moved with purpose, remembering orders without writing them down, handling a difficult customer with patience, helping the busboy clear a large table even though it wasn't her job. She worked like someone who understood the value of employment, who couldn't afford to make mistakes. The evening wound down. Burke left, probably to figure out where he'd find $200,000. The families finished their meals and departed into the rain. By 9:30, the restaurant was half empty, and Dominic was on his third scotch, in no hurry to return to his empty penthouse. Ruby came by to clear his plates. As she reached for his empty glass, her hand brushed against the salt shaker, knocking it over. A small thing, meaningless, but Dominic saw her freeze for a half second, saw something like fear flicker across her face. She righted the shaker quickly, cleaning up the spilled salt with her napkin. I'm sorry, Mr. Castellano. He waved it off. It's salt, Ruby, not the end of the world. But as she walked away, he noticed her hands were shaking slightly. And in that moment, Dominic realized she'd been performing all evening. The calm professionalism, the steady voice, the polite smiles. Underneath, she was terrified of him. Everyone was terrified of him. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Don't let them see you weak. For the first time in 17 years, Dominic wondered if his father had been wrong. The following week brought unseasonably warm weather to Chicago, the kind of Indian summer that made people forget winter was coming. Dominic spent his days managing the business, meeting with his accountant about the new money laundering scheme through the construction companies, negotiating with the Italians from Boston who wanted access to his gambling operations, resolving a dispute between two of his lieutenants over territory. It was exhausting work that never ended. For every problem he solved, 3 more appeared. Carlo had once told him that running an organization was like fighting the tide. You never won. You just tried not to drown. But his evenings, he found himself returning to Santino's more often than usual. Not for business meetings, not for the food. He told himself he was checking on his investment, making sure the restaurant ran smoothly, but the truth, which he barely admitted to himself, was that he enjoyed watching Ruby work. She fascinated him in a way he couldn't explain. There was a resilience to her, a quiet strength that reminded him of his mother, who'd raised 3 boys while his father built an empire. Ruby never complained, never asked for special treatment, never tried to use her looks to get better tips. She simply worked, hour after hour, with a professionalism that put the veteran servers to shame. He learned more about her through observation and careful questions to the manager, Anthony. Ruby worked 3 jobs: Santino's 5 nights a week, a coffee shop near Northwestern in the mornings, and weekend shifts at a hospital gift shop. She lived in a studio apartment in Pilsen with her mother, who had stage 4 cancer. The medical bills were crushing her, despite Medicaid. She slept maybe 4 hours a night. Dominic found himself thinking about her at odd moments. During a meeting with his lawyer, discussing how to handle a witness who might testify against one of his men, while reviewing the books for his legitimate businesses, seeing the millions flow through accounts. Late at night, standing in his penthouse looking out at the glittering city, wondering what it was like to struggle the way Ruby struggled. He'd grown up with money, even before his father's organization took off. He'd never worked 3 jobs, never had to choose between medicine and rent, never felt the kind of desperation that showed in the tightness around Ruby's eyes when she smiled. It made him uncomfortable, this awareness. His world worked because he didn't think too hard about the people his actions affected. The store owner who paid protection money, the construction workers who took cash under the table, the addicts who bought drugs from dealers who paid him a percentage. They were abstractions, necessary components of the machine that generated his wealth and power. But Ruby was real, immediate, and impossible to ignore. On Wednesday, he watched her handle a drunk customer who grabbed her wrist, his voice loud and crude. She extracted herself with practiced ease, maintained her composure, and had Vincent escort the man out without making a scene. When she returned to work, her hands shook for 5 minutes, but her face remained calm. On Friday, he saw her split her tips with the busboy, a kid fresh from Guatemala who barely spoke English. Anthony later told him Ruby had been helping the kid learn English on their breaks, using flashcards she made herself. On Saturday, she showed up for her shift with bruise-colored shadows under her eyes and moved like every step hurt. She'd pulled a double at the hospital gift shop the day before, standing for 16 hours straight. Dominic found his carefully constructed worldview cracking. He'd always justified his choices with a simple logic. The world was divided into the strong and the weak, the predators and the prey. He was strong, therefore he took what he wanted. People like Ruby were weak, therefore they struggled. But watching her, he realized strength had nothing to do with power or money. Ruby was stronger than anyone he knew, fighting battles he'd never had to face with weapons he'd never had to use. Dignity, persistence, hope. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. That Saturday night, as the restaurant filled with its weekend crowd, something shifted. Dominic was meeting with Tommy and Marco, discussing a problem with one of their gambling houses, a dealer skimming profits. The conversation was routine. The solution would be violent, but necessary. That was how his world worked. Ruby approached to take their orders, her professional mask in place. As she recited the specials, a group of young men at the next table, college kids from their appearance, drunk and loud, started making comments. At first, just observations about the food, then about the service, then about Ruby. "Hey, sweetheart, you come with the meal? I'll give you a tip, baby. Come sit on my lap. Damn, she's got a nice ass. Turn around, honey, give us a show." Dominic felt something dark and cold settle in his chest. He glanced at Ruby's face and saw the practiced blankness, the way she ignored them while taking his table's order. This wasn't new for her. She dealt with this constantly. His men noticed his attention. Marco started to stand, but Dominic shook his head slightly. Not yet. Ruby finished taking their orders and turned to the college kids' table. Dominic couldn't hear the exchange, but he saw one of them, a blonde kid in a Northwestern hoodie, reach out and slap her on the backside as she walked past. The restaurant seemed to pause. Every eye turned to Ruby, then to Dominic's table, wondering what would happen. Everyone knew whose restaurant this was. Everyone knew what happened to people who disrespected anything connected to Dominic Castellano. Ruby stood very still for a moment, her back to the kid, her shoulders rigid. Then she turned around, and Dominic saw something remarkable. She was smiling, but it was sharp as a blade. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet restaurant, "I understand you're celebrating something tonight, but if you touch me again, I'll break your hand with the pepper grinder, get myself fired, probably arrested, and lose everything I've worked for. But it'll be worth it to see the look on your face when you realize that being rich doesn't make you untouchable." The restaurant held its breath. The kids stared at her, shocked into silence. His friends looked uncomfortable, suddenly aware they'd crossed a line. And Dominic, watching from his booth, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Admiration. Maybe even respect. He stood up slowly. The sound of his chair scraping the floor cut through the silence like a knife. Every eye turned to him. He walked across the restaurant with deliberate steps, his men falling in behind him. The college kids went pale. Dominic stopped at their table, looking down at the blonde kid with the dead-eyed stare that had made grown men weep. "You're leaving," he said quietly. "Now. And you're never coming back. Not to this restaurant. Not to this neighborhood. If I see you here again, you'll wish the lady with the pepper grinder had gotten to you first." They scrambled for the exit, tripping over each other, abandoning their food and drinks. The door banged shut behind them. Dominic turned to Ruby. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Not gratitude, not fear, something more complex. "You okay?" "I had it handled, Mr. Castellano." "I know you did." And he meant it. "But nobody disrespects you in my restaurant." Something flickered in her eyes. That skepticism again. Is that what this is about? Disrespect to you? The question caught him off guard. She was right, of course. He'd acted because those kids had challenged his authority by disrespecting someone under his protection. But was that the only reason? Before he could answer, she said, "Thank you anyway," and walked back to the kitchen. Dominic returned to his table, aware of the whispers starting around the room, the story already forming that would spread through the neighborhood by morning. But his mind was on Ruby's question. Is that what this is about? He didn't know anymore. November settled over Chicago with gray skies and bitter wind that cut through the streets like knives made of ice. Dominic's world grew more complicated. The Boston Italians weren't satisfied with the territory he'd offered and were pushing for more. The FBI had started sniffing around his construction companies, which meant someone was talking. 2 of his dealers had been arrested, which created supply problems and nervous customers. And his ex-wife was threatening to petition the court to terminate his parental rights unless he went to rehab for a drinking problem he didn't have. The pressure was constant, exhausting. Every decision rippled outward in ways he couldn't always predict. Every show of weakness invited challenge. His father's empire, which he'd worked so hard to preserve and expand, suddenly felt like a weight around his neck, dragging him down. Through it all, Santino's remained his refuge. 4 nights a week, sometimes 5, he'd sit in his booth, nursing scotch, pretending to review paperwork while actually watching Ruby navigate her section with quiet efficiency. He'd learned more about her in small increments. Her mother, Helen, had worked as an elementary school teacher before the cancer. Her father had died in Iraq when Ruby was 12, a Marine sergeant who'd stepped on an IED outside Fallujah. She had no siblings, no boyfriend, no safety net except her own determination and the increasingly fragile hope that her mother might somehow survive. The medical bills were destroying her. Anthony mentioned she'd asked about picking up extra shifts, but she was already working the maximum hours labor laws allowed. She'd started selling things, her laptop, her television, a guitar she'd played since high school. Dominic found himself angry on her behalf, at a system that could crush someone like her for the crime of loving her mother. It was hypocritical anger. His gambling operations ruined families. His loan sharks destroyed people who couldn't pay. His drug dealers created addicts who stole from their parents. He'd built his fortune on other people's desperation. But Ruby was different. She was in front of him, real and immediate, and he couldn't maintain the comfortable distance that let him sleep at night. On a Thursday in mid-November, he found himself making a decision that surprised even him. He called Anthony into his office at the restaurant after closing. "Ruby Morgan," he said without preamble. "Double her salary. Make it come from operational budget adjustment. Nothing that looks like charity. And make sure she knows it's based on her performance, not anything else." Anthony's expression was carefully neutral. "Yes, Mr. Castellano. May I ask?" "No." Anthony nodded and left. Dominic told himself it was pragmatic. Good employees deserved compensation. Ruby worked harder than anyone on staff. It made business sense. He almost believed it. The following Friday, Ruby approached his table with something different in her expression, a wariness that hadn't been there before. She set down his scotch and said, "Mr. Castellano, can I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course." She glanced around, lowering her voice. "Anthony told me about the raise. It's generous. Too generous. I need to know what you expect in return." Dominic felt something cold in his stomach. "Nothing. You're a good employee. You earned it. No one gets something for nothing. Not in your world." She met his eyes directly, and he saw she wasn't afraid. She was angry. "I know who you are. I know what you do. I don't judge you for it. But I need to know what this costs me." For a moment, he couldn't speak. Everyone in his life wanted something from him. Money, power, protection, opportunity. They fawned and flattered and pretended the source of his wealth didn't matter. Ruby was the first person in years to look at him with clear eyes and ask the question everyone else avoided. "It cost you nothing," he said finally. "I don't operate that way, Ruby. Not with you." "Why not?" "Because you remind me that there are still good people in this city. That's rare enough to be valuable in itself." She studied him for a long moment, and he couldn't tell what she was thinking. Finally, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Castellano. But if that changes, if you ever want something in return, tell me directly. I'd rather know where I stand." She walked away before he could respond. Vincent, who'd witnessed the exchange from his post by the door, caught Dominic's eye and made a small gesture. What was that about? Dominic shook his head. He didn't know how to explain it. The rest of November brought escalating problems. The Boston situation deteriorated when one of their men was found dead in a dumpster behind one of Dominic's gambling houses. It looked like a message. Dominic had to respond, which meant violence, which meant risk. He authorized a proportional reply. Nothing fatal, but painful enough to reestablish boundaries. The FBI pressure increased. They served subpoenas to 3 of his shell companies, requesting documents that would take months to produce and lawyer armies to protect. His accountant warned him they were building a RICO case, trying to connect the dots between his legitimate businesses and the criminal operations. His ex-wife made good on her threat, filing a motion to terminate his parental rights. The court date was set for January. His lawyer said they'd fight it, but the odds weren't good. Organized crime figures didn't win custody battles. Through it all, he kept returning to Santino's, to the one place where the walls didn't feel like they were closing in. Ruby's presence had become an anchor point, something clean and honest in a world of lies and violence. He started leaving larger tips. $100, $200, once $500. She always looked at the money with that same expression, part gratitude, part suspicion, then split it with the other servers and the kitchen staff. She never kept more than her share. In early December, Chicago got its first real snowstorm. 6 inches fell in 3 hours, turning the city white and snarling traffic. Dominic was at Santino's when it started, watching through the windows as the snow transformed the ugly streets into something almost beautiful. Ruby worked her shift, and he noticed she kept checking her phone, her expression growing more worried as the evening progressed. Around 8, she approached his table. "Mr. Castellano, I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to leave early. My mom's home health aide can't make it through the snow, and I need to get back to give her medication." "Of course. Go." She hesitated. "It's just, Anthony already cut 2 servers because of the weather, and we're short-staffed. I don't want to put him in a bad position." Dominic looked at her. This woman who worked 3 jobs, slept 4 hours a night, was drowning in medical bills, and was worried about inconveniencing her manager. "Ruby, go take care of your mother. The restaurant will survive." She nodded, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you. How are you getting home?" "The trains are delayed. I'll walk. It's only 3 miles. 3 miles in a blizzard. At night. Through one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Chicago. Vincent will drive you." "That's not necessary." It wasn't a request. He softened his tone. "Please, let me help." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her weighing options, calculating risks. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, thank you." Dominic watched through the window as Vincent pulled up in the black SUV, saw Ruby climb in, saw them disappear into the swirling snow. He told himself it was simple pragmatism. He couldn't afford to lose a good employee to hypothermia or worse. But the truth was more complicated. Somewhere in the past month, Ruby had become important to him in a way that had nothing to do with business, and that terrified him more than the FBI, more than the Boston Italians, more than any threat he'd faced in 17 years, because caring about someone meant vulnerability. It meant weakness. And in his world, weakness was death. The week before Christmas, Dominic's world collapsed. It started with Tommy, loyal Tommy, who'd been with him for 12 years, who'd stood beside him during the transition after Carlo died, who'd never questioned an order or shown a moment of disloyalty. The FBI picked him up on Tuesday morning outside his apartment in Bridgeport. 3 agents, a warrant, and enough evidence to guarantee 20 years if he didn't flip. Dominic heard about it within an hour. He called his lawyer, who confirmed what he already knew. Tommy was done. The question was whether Tommy would take everyone else down with him. By Wednesday afternoon, they had their answer. Tommy's lawyer reached out with an offer, cooperation in exchange for witness protection. Tommy would testify about the gambling operations, the loan sharking, the money laundering. He'd wear a wire. He'd give them everything. Marco wanted to kill Tommy before he could talk. Vincent suggested killing Tommy's family to send a message. Dominic sat in his office above Santino's, looking out at the Christmas lights strung along the street, and felt something break inside him. This was his father's world. This was the legacy Carlo had built. Violence breeding violence. Loyalty maintained through fear. Trust and illusion that shattered the moment pressure was applied. For 17 years, Dominic had played by these rules, convinced himself it was necessary, told himself he was strong because he could make hard decisions. But sitting there, listening to his men discuss murder like it was a business transaction, he felt sick. "No," he said quietly. Marco and Vincent looked at him. "Boss, we have to." "No," louder this time. "Tommy made his choice. We let him live. We protect ourselves legally. We prepare for the investigation. But we don't kill him. And we don't touch his family." "That makes us look weak," Vincent protested. "I don't care." They stared at him like he'd grown a second head. In their world, his world, this was insanity. You eliminated threats. You maintained power through fear. You never showed mercy because mercy was weakness. "Get out," Dominic said. "Both of you. I need to think." They left, exchanging worried glances. Dominic knew what they were thinking. The boss was losing it. Stress, pressure, maybe time for a change in leadership. He almost laughed. They were probably right. That night, he went to Santino's and drank. 4 scotches, 5, lost count after that. The restaurant buzzed with holiday cheer, families celebrating, friends exchanging gifts, the air thick with the smell of wine and garlic and contentment. It all felt surreal, like watching life through thick glass. Ruby approached his table, concern in her eyes. "Mr. Castellano, can I call someone for you? Vincent, maybe." "No." His voice was rough. "Just another drink. I think you've had enough." He looked up at her. This woman who had 3 jobs and a dying mother, and every reason to be bitter and broken, yet somehow maintained grace and dignity. "You ever feel like you've wasted your life, Ruby? Built something impressive that turns out to be completely worthless?" She sat down across from him, an action so unexpected it cut through his alcoholic haze. Employees didn't sit with him uninvited. No one did. "Every day," she said quietly. "I dropped out of school. I'm watching my mom die one day at a time. I work until I can't feel my feet, and I'm still drowning in debt. Sometimes I wake up and think, is this all there is? Is this my life? So yeah, Mr. Castellano, I know what it feels like to think you've wasted everything. But you keep going, because the alternative is giving up. And I can't do that while my mom needs me." Dominic stared at her. "I've hurt people, Ruby. A lot of people. Built an empire on their suffering. And for what? Money I don't need? Power that makes me a target? Respect that's just fear wearing a nicer mask?" She didn't look shocked or disgusted, just sad. "So change. It's not that simple. It never is. But you're Dominic Castellano. You run half this city. If you can do that, you can change your life." He wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to believe her. But his father's voice was there in his head. "Don't let them see you weak. You should go," he said. "I'm not good company tonight." Ruby stood, but before leaving, she said, "For what it's worth, I think you're better than you believe you are." After she left, he sat alone until closing, then stumbled to his car. Vincent materialized from somewhere, took his keys, drove him home. The penthouse was cold and empty. He stood at the window looking out at Chicago, this city he'd conquered, and felt nothing but exhaustion. The next morning brought worse news. The FBI had raided 3 of his businesses, the construction company, a restaurant in River North, and his accountant's office. They'd seized computers, documents, and frozen several bank accounts. His lawyer called with an estimate. Defending against the RICO case would cost millions, and probably fail. They had Tommy's testimony, financial records, and years of surveillance. Dominic was looking at 30 years minimum if convicted. That afternoon, his ex-wife's lawyer called. She wasn't waiting for the court date. She was filing for an emergency custody order, citing his FBI investigation as proof he was an unfit parent. He'd lose Sophia, probably permanently this time. By evening, he'd received calls from the Boston Italians, from his partners in the gambling operations, from a dozen other associates, all with the same message: fix this, or we'll fix it ourselves. His empire was fracturing. His authority was collapsing. He'd spent 17 years building his father's dream, and it was disintegrating in 48 hours. That night, he didn't go to Santino's. He sat in his penthouse, staring at his father's watch, and realized Carlo had been wrong about everything. Strength wasn't about power or fear. Respect wasn't about dominance. Legacy wasn't about empire. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Castellano, it's Ruby. Anthony gave me your number. I heard about your troubles. I'm sorry. If you need to talk, I'm here." He stared at the message for a long time. Then he called her. She answered on the second ring. "Hello? Why would you help me?" His voice was raw. "You know what I am. Because I've seen who you could be. And because everyone deserves a chance to become better." They talked for 3 hours. Not about business or the FBI or his collapsing world. About his daughter. About his mother, who died when he was 20. About the choices that had led him here, and the regrets that kept him awake at night. Ruby listened, occasionally offering quiet observations that cut through his justifications and excuses. She didn't judge. She didn't offer solutions. She just listened. When they finally hung up, Dominic felt something he hadn't felt in 17 years. Hope. Not for his empire or his freedom, but for something more important. The possibility of becoming someone his daughter wouldn't fear. Someone he could respect when he looked in the mirror. The next morning, he made a decision that would change everything. He called his lawyer and told him to make a deal with the FBI. Christmas week in Chicago was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that froze your breath and turned the lake to ice. Dominic spent it in a conference room at the FBI field office, surrounded by lawyers and agents, negotiating the price of his cooperation. The deal was brutal. He'd testify against the Boston organization, reveal his connections to corrupt politicians and police, provide evidence of money laundering operations across 5 states. In exchange, he'd serve 7 years minimum in a federal facility, lose most of his assets except enough to support his daughter, and enter a form of supervised release that would control his life for a decade after prison. It meant destroying the empire his father built. It meant becoming the thing his world considered lowest: a rat, a snitch, a traitor. Men who'd once feared him would now hunt him. Associates would spend years planning revenge. His name would become synonymous with betrayal. Marco and Vincent found out on December 23rd. They came to the penthouse, and Dominic saw in their eyes what came next. Violence. Maybe death. He didn't care anymore. He was tired of fear, tired of the weight, tired of being his father's son instead of Sophia's father. "You can't do this," Marco said, his voice shaking. "You can't betray us. Everything we built was built on suffering," Dominic interrupted, "on addiction and debt and fear. And I'm done. You want to kill me, Marco? Go ahead. I won't stop you. But it won't change anything. The FBI has everything they need. Tommy already gave them most of it. I'm just finishing the job." Vincent's hand moved toward his jacket. Dominic stood perfectly still, watching him, almost curious what would happen next. Then Vincent's hand fell to his side. "We're not killers, Dom. Not really. We're just guys who convinced ourselves we had to be." He looked at Marco. "Let's go." They left. Dominic watched them through the window, 2 figures disappearing into the snowy night, and felt a strange sense of loss. They'd been his brothers in everything but blood. Now they were strangers. He called Ruby. It had become a habit over the past week, these late-night conversations. She never asked about the FBI or the legal situation. She talked about her mom, about books she'd loved, about dreams of finishing nursing school someday. She made him laugh, which seemed impossible given everything falling apart around him. "I'm going to prison," he told her that night. 7 years minimum. Silence on the line. Then, "I'm sorry. Don't be. It's what I deserve. Maybe less than I deserve. What about Sophia?" My lawyer thinks this might actually help with custody. Shows I'm trying to change. Probably won't see her much during the sentence, but after..." He trailed off. "At least she'll know I chose her over the business. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Ruby said softly. They talked until 3 in the morning. About redemption. About whether people could truly change, or just became better at hiding who they were. About the difference between justice and revenge. When he finally hung up, Dominic realized he was falling in love with her. Not the possessive, consuming kind of love his world understood. Something gentler and more terrifying. Respect, admiration, hope. It was the worst possible timing and completely impossible. He was going to prison. She was struggling to survive. They lived in different universes, but the feeling was there, real and undeniable. On Christmas Eve, he went to Santino's one last time. The restaurant was closing early for the holiday. Just a few final customers finishing their meals. Ruby was working, moving through her section with the same efficient grace he'd watched for months. He sat in his usual booth. She brought him scotch without being asked. "Last night?" she asked. "Yeah. I report to federal custody on the 27th. She sat down across from him again. Anthony saw but didn't say anything. "I'll miss you, Mr. Castellano." "Dominic, please. I think we're past formality." "Dominic, then." She smiled, and it reached her eyes this time. "You're doing the right thing. Doesn't feel right. Feels like I'm abandoning everything my father built. Your father built a cage and called it a kingdom. You're choosing to leave the cage. That takes more courage than staying. I'm scared, Ruby." He'd never admitted that to anyone. Not of prison, of what comes after. Who am I if I'm not Carlo Castellano's son? If I'm not the boss? He reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, calloused from work. "You're the man who chose his daughter over power. The man who stopped a cycle of violence. The man who's trying to become better. That's not nothing, Dominic. That's everything." They sat like that for a long time, holding hands across the table in an empty restaurant while snow fell outside. It was the most intimate moment of Dominic's life, more real than any relationship he'd had, built on honesty instead of power. Finally, Ruby said, "I need to tell you something. My mom died yesterday." Dominic felt his breath catch. "God, Ruby, I'm so sorry. Why are you here? You should be..." "There's nothing to do. She's gone. The funeral is next week. I couldn't stay in that apartment alone, and I needed..." She paused. "I needed to be somewhere normal, to feel like the world keeps turning. Take time off, as much as you need. I can't afford to. The hospital bills don't stop just because..." She couldn't finish. Dominic made a decision. "How much?" "What? How much do you owe? For your mother's care?" Ruby pulled her hand back. "No. Dominic, no. You've already done too much. I'm going to prison for 7 years. My assets are being seized, but I have access to one account the FBI doesn't know about. Emergency money my father stashed decades ago. It's sitting there doing nothing. Let me use it to help you. Please." "Why would you do that?" "Because you showed me what strength really looks like. Because you listened when I needed someone. Because in a life full of transactions and violence and emptiness, you were real. And because He stopped, suddenly unsure. "Because you what?" "Because I care about you, Ruby. More than I should. More than makes sense given that I'm about to disappear for 7 years. But I do." She looked at him with those green eyes that had first caught his attention months ago, and he saw tears forming. "I care about you too. I shouldn't. You're a criminal. You've done terrible things, but somewhere underneath the reputation and the fear, you're just a person trying to figure out how to be better. And that person is worth caring about. 7 years is a long time." "It is." She smiled through the tears. "But I'm good at waiting. I've been waiting my whole life for things to get better. I can wait a little longer." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a commitment. It was just an acknowledgement that something existed between them. Something that might survive the years ahead, or might fade into memory. But it was real, and that mattered. Dominic paid her mother's medical bills the next day. $240,000 that he would never miss, and that changed Ruby's entire life. She cried when she found out, called him sobbing and grateful and angry that he'd done it without asking permission. He told her to finish nursing school, to build the life her mother had wanted for her, to become the person she was meant to be. On December 27th, Dominic reported to federal custody. His lawyer met him there. Vincent was there too, surprisingly, standing in the parking lot in the cold. "Didn't think you'd come," Dominic said. "Neither did I." Vincent looked uncomfortable. You're doing something brave, Dom. It'll take me time to understand it, but I think maybe you're right. Maybe we all need to find a way out of the cage. They shook hands. Then Dominic walked into the building, surrendered himself, and began his sentence. 7 years was a lifetime and a moment. Dominic served his sentence at a medium-security federal facility in downstate Illinois, in a cell that smelled like disinfectant and contained 2 books, a narrow bed, and nothing that reminded him of the empire he'd ruled. The first year was brutal. He was known, recognized, targeted by men who wanted to make their reputation or settle old scores. He took 3 beatings in 6 months before the warden moved him to protective custody. The isolation was worse than the violence. 23 hours a day in a small cell, 1 hour in a caged exercise yard, no contact except guards and lawyers. But gradually, something shifted. He started taking classes, business administration, which made him laugh at the irony. He read voraciously, everything from philosophy to fiction, trying to understand the world beyond the narrow parameters of his father's legacy. He attended therapy, court-ordered at first, then voluntarily, working through the trauma and violence that had shaped him. Most importantly, he wrote to Sophia. Letters every week, sometimes every day, telling her about what he was learning, asking about her life, apologizing for the years he'd prioritized power over being present. His ex-wife screened the letters at first, but gradually she softened, allowing supervised phone calls, then visits. The first time Sophia visited, she was 9 years old, confused and scared. The last time she was 15, still cautious but willing to listen when he explained why he'd made the choices he had. I want to be someone you're proud of, he told her during that final visit. Not because of money or power, but because of who I am. That's going to take time, maybe years, but I'm trying. I know, Dad, Sophia said, and for the first time since he'd been arrested, she hugged him. Throughout it all, Ruby wrote, letters arrived every 2 weeks, telling him about finishing nursing school, about her first job at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, about the apartment she'd rented in a better neighborhood, about her life slowly rebuilding after her mother's death. She never promised anything, never said she was waiting for him, but the letters kept coming, a steady reminder that someone outside saw him as more than his worst choices. In his 5th year, Dominic testified. 6 trials, dozens of depositions, hundreds of hours in courtrooms recounting the details of his criminal enterprise. He watched powerful men sent to prison, saw his former associates escorted away in handcuffs, helped dismantled corruption networks that had operated for decades. It was exhausting and painful and necessary. His father's legacy ended in those courtrooms, transformed from an empire into evidence exhibits and criminal case numbers. When it was over, the lead FBI agent, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd pursued him for years, came to see him in prison. You did good work, Castellano, she said. You helped us take down one of the largest criminal organizations in the Midwest. That matters. Doesn't erase what I did. No, but it's something, and sometimes something is enough to build on. In his 7th year, Dominic was transferred to a minimum security facility for the final months of his sentence. He could work in the prison's maintenance department, have longer visits, prepare for release. Ruby came to visit for the first time. They'd talked on the phone occasionally, brief supervised calls, but seeing her in person after all those years was startling. She'd cut her hair shorter. She wore scrubs with a Northwestern Hospital ID badge. She looked older, more confident, more settled. They sat across from each other in the visitation room, and for a long moment, neither spoke. You look good, Dominic finally said. You look different. She studied his face. Lighter, somehow. I feel lighter, like I've been carrying my father's ghost for 17 years, and someone finally let me put him down. They talked for 2 hours, about her work, which she loved, about his plans after release. He'd enrolled in an online degree program, was considering teaching GED classes to at-risk youth, about whether the thing between them had survived 7 years of letters and phone calls and separate lives. I don't know what this is, Ruby admitted. I care about you, but you're essentially a stranger who's been in prison for 7 years. I know, but I'd like to find out, if you want to. I want to, Dominic said. More than anything. He was released on a Tuesday in March, 7 years and 2 months after surrendering himself. Vincent met him at the gate. Improbably, they'd stayed in contact, Vincent having left the organization years earlier to run a legitimate security business. Welcome back to the world, Dom, Vincent said, shaking his hand. They drove to Chicago through gray spring rain. The city had changed. New buildings, different skyline, gentrification pushing through neighborhoods he'd once controlled. Or maybe the city was the same, and he was different, seeing it with new eyes. Vincent dropped him at a halfway house on the north side. Dominic's room was small, clean, spare. Another cell, essentially, but one he could leave during approved hours. He had $17 in his pocket, a box of belongings, and a list of conditions for his supervised release. His first call was to Sophia. She answered immediately. "Dad? Hey, sweetheart. I'm out." Silence, then crying. "Can I see you? I'd like that. Let me get settled. Talk to your mom, figure out the rules. But yes, soon." His second call was to Ruby. She answered on the third ring, slightly breathless. "Dominic, hi." Another silence. Then, "Do you want to meet? For coffee?" "I'd love that." They met at a cafe near Northwestern, a place with terrible coffee and mismatched furniture that was nothing like the expensive restaurants Dominic had frequented in his old life. Ruby was waiting at a corner table, wearing jeans and a sweater, looking nervous and hopeful. He sat down across from her. Up close, he could see the small changes 7 years had carved, fine lines at the corners of her eyes, a confidence in how she held herself, a peace that hadn't been there when she was drowning in debt and grief. "You made it," she said. "Thanks to you. Your letters kept me sane. You did the hard work. I just reminded you that someone was out here rooting for you." They talked for 3 hours, nursing terrible coffee and sharing a bagel, relearning each other. It felt different than their late-night phone calls from prison. More real, more complicated, more uncertain. When they finally left, stepping out into the Chicago evening, Ruby took his hand. "This doesn't have to be anything. We can just be friends who had a strange connection during a difficult time. Is that what you want?" She looked at him, and he saw the same thing he'd seen 7 years ago when she'd thrown his tip back at him. Honesty, courage, and a refusal to accept easy lies. "No, but I want us to figure it out slowly, without pressure or expectations. Can you do that? I've waited 7 years. I can wait a little longer." They started slowly. Coffee once a week, then twice. Walks along the lakeshore. A movie, which was overwhelming after years of prison. Dinners at casual restaurants where Dominic learned to order without feeling the weight of power and reputation. He found work at a community center, teaching classes to former inmates trying to get their GED. The pay was terrible. The work was exhausting, and it was the most meaningful thing he'd ever done. 6 months after his release, Sophia asked if she could meet Ruby. They had lunch at a diner in Lakeview. His daughter, now 16, and cautiously optimistic about having her father back in her life, and the woman who'd somehow believed in his ability to change. Sophia liked Ruby immediately. They talked about nursing. Sophia was considering medicine as a career, about school, about Sophia's love of soccer, which Dominic hadn't known because he'd been too busy building an empire to pay attention. After Sophia left, Ruby said, "She's amazing. You must be so proud." "I am, and terrified I'll mess it up again." "You won't, because you're not the same person anymore." A year after his release, on a cold October evening that reminded him of the night he'd first seen Ruby, Dominic took her to Santino's. The restaurant had changed ownership when his assets were seized, but the new owner had kept the name and most of the staff. Anthony was still managing, now with an ownership stake. They sat in the booth where Dominic had spent hundreds of evenings, but it felt different now. Not a throne, just a table. Not a kingdom, just a restaurant. "This is where it started," Ruby said, "where you made a joke that you never actually tell me about." Dominic laughed. "I didn't make a joke. That title was always a mystery to me too. What happened was, you returned my tip and told me that money didn't make me untouchable. That shocked everyone far more than any joke I could have made. I was so angry that night, and so scared I'd lose my job. You were magnificent." They ate dinner, talking about small things, her shifts at the hospital, his students at the community center, plans for Thanksgiving, normal things, beautiful things. As they left, walking out into the October night, Ruby stopped on the sidewalk. Rain was starting to fall, light and cold, turning the streetlights into halos. "I love you," she said. "I've loved you for years, but I needed to make sure we were real. That this wasn't just trauma bonding or gratitude or some kind of prison fantasy. But it's real, Dominic. You're real." He pulled her close, feeling rain soak into his jacket, and kissed her. It was his first kiss in 7 years, and it felt like coming home. "I love you too," he said. You saved my life, Ruby. In every way a person can be saved. 2 years later, they married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with Sophia as Ruby's bridesmaid and Vincent as Dominic's best man. They moved into a modest apartment in Rogers Park, both working jobs that mattered more than they paid, building a life that had nothing to do with power or empire, and everything to do with choosing each other every day. Dominic never forgot who he'd been. The weight of his past crimes remained, a responsibility he carried in the work he did, and the amends he tried to make. But he'd learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future worth living, one small choice at a time. On their first anniversary, he took Ruby back to Santino's. They sat in the old booth, and he pulled out a photograph, the only picture he had from his old life, taken years before everything fell apart. Carlo Castellano, looking stern and powerful, wearing the same gold watch Dominic had inherited. "My father told me never to show weakness," Dominic said. He believed strength was about power and fear, but he was wrong. Real strength is admitting when you've failed, asking for help, choosing to become better even when it costs you everything you thought mattered. He looked at Ruby, this woman who'd worked 3 jobs and never lost her dignity, who'd offered compassion when he deserved judgment, who'd waited while he became someone worthy of her love. "You taught me that," he said. "The moment you threw my money back at me, I saw real strength for the first time. It took me 7 years to understand it, but you saved me that night." Ruby took his hand, squeezing gently. "We saved each other. I was drowning in debt and grief, convinced I'd never escape. You gave me a chance to breathe, to dream again. We're even." They sat together as rain began to fall outside, turning the Chicago streets into rivers of reflected light, the same rain that had fallen the night they met, but everything else was different. Dominic Castellano no longer owned half the South Side. He had no empire, no power, no reputation, except as a former criminal trying to make amends. He lived in a small apartment, worked for barely enough money, and spent his evenings helping teenagers who reminded him of the person he might have been if someone had shown him a different path. And he'd never been happier. Because he'd finally learned what his father never understood, that the strongest thing a person can do is choose love over power, redemption over reputation, and the courage to become better over the comfort of staying the same. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the streets clean. Inside Santino's, in the booth where his old life had ended and his new one had begun, Dominic held Ruby's hand and watched the city through the window, grateful for second chances and the woman who'd believed in his before he believed in himself. Thank you for listening to this story about redemption, courage, and second chances. If you enjoyed hearing about Dominic and Ruby's journey, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more emotionally powerful stories. Leave a comment telling us what part resonated most with you, and share where in the world you're listening from. Your support helps us continue bringing these meaningful narratives to life. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be.